going up. Elevator systems. Bowen family systems theory in brief for a life of learning. Welcome to Elevator Systems, the podcast that looks at concepts from Bowen family systems theory in brief and understandable ways. Today we are talking about emotional cutoff. Joining Katie and I is a guest who, in the time before podcasts, hosted a television show all about Bowen theory called Family Matters, which is now thankfully on YouTube. So I'm so pleased to introduce our guest for today, Dr. Mariana Martinez. Hello.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. I'll do your bio to begin with. Mariana is a clinical psychologist who has applied Bowen theory in her teaching, clinical practice, and leadership roles. After earning her doctorate in clinical psychology, which focused on child and family studies, she joined the Bowen Center in 2008 and then joined the faculty in 2012. At the Bowen Center, Mariana directed the Family Clinic for 6 years, hosted over 100 episodes of Family Matters, and founded the Ibero-American Institute to promote Bowen theory in Spanish-speaking countries. She is also the executive director for Family Wealth and Culture Services at Wells Fargo Bank. Originally from Mexico, she now lives in Potomac, Maryland, where she contributes to the academic and clinical development of Bowen theory while also maintaining strong ties to her cultural roots. It's quite the bio. All right. Well, I'm very interested in our conversation today. I was going to jokingly say we're getting out the scissors because we're talking about cutoff, and I've thought about so many phrases these days, like I blocked her, I unfriended them, I'm cutting people out of my life. But I think Bowen theory has sort of a deeper way of thinking about these processes. And is emotional cutoff the same as getting out the scissors in our relationships? So we'll answer some of these questions, but Mariana, would you begin with your elevator pitch of emotional cutoff?
Emotional cutoff, one of the core concepts in Bowen theory. I'm going to say this, the emotional cutoff is the opposite of having a person-to-person relationship with many members of your extended family as possible. This approach is the most effective way, meaning having a contact, one-on-one person-to-person contact with others is the most effective way to progress towards emotional maturity. However, it can also be very anxiety provoking, and distancing between generations, which is cutoff, and it's extreme, like distances happens a lot, but the extreme cutoff develops within families as a way to manage anxiety with emotional togetherness.
Great. Katie, your turn.
Thank you. I was glad you brought up that distance cutoff difference. I hope we're going to talk more about that. My pitch is cutoff occurs between generations in a family, and it's how adults manage their unresolved attachment to their parents, which is one of those terms in Bowen theory that I wanted to say in a different way, that there is a way that the anxiety rises in the family, as Mariana was talking about, where people can't manage the sensitivity they have towards their parents and their family and hold on to the person that they are, so that they exit the family, either physically, where they move far away, or it could be just emotionally, where they just don't talk about any personal things with the people in the family, which I wanted to punch up that point because I think it is unique that you could live in the same household and be quite cut off from your family, or you could live in the other side of the world and be cut off from your family. And the thing I wanted to put in my pitch that I hope we'll talk a little bit more about, but is that this is something that just happens in families. So I think, hopefully Bowen theory isn't saying that this is good or bad, but this is just a pattern that can occur in a family that can have advantages and disadvantages. And I hope we get to talk more about that. So there's my pitch and push to talk more.
Yeah. Well, mine I don't know if it makes it a little bit more general, but here's what I came up with. Emotional cutoff describes the way people try to manage discomfort and distress in relationships by attempting to completely disconnect from others, especially one's own family. This may give some breathing room for a while, but as the saying goes, your problems follow you. Instead, the emotional connection we have with someone may not decrease when there's less contact. Just think about the energy that gets stirred when you think about a person you can't stand or you absolutely don't want to see. You might not give them the time of day in person, but they probably get a lot of airtime in your mind. So the concept also highlights that same discomfort you ran from in one relationship will likely replicate in other relationships. And then I have, for Dr. Bowen's pitch today, just a whole bunch of really short quotes. So he added this concept to the theory in 1975. And he says it deals with the way people separate themselves from the past in order to start their lives in the present generation. Talked about the selection of the term and how important it was, describing the process of separation, isolation, withdrawal, running away, or denying the importance of the parental family. He discussed the person who runs away from his family of origin is as emotionally dependent as the one who never leaves home. They both need emotional closeness, but they are allergic to it. He talks about some of this inner and outer stuff that Katie highlighted. And the last one from Dr. Bowen is the more one denies the attachment to the past, the less choice one has in determining the pattern with his own wife and children. And he says that often when people cut off, the next generation, say their own children, will maybe do a more intense cutoff with them. And then from a Family Matters episode that I just watched the other week, Victoria Harrison said, "We take with us the reactivity we run from," which I always wonder if that's similar to Carl Jung's famous quote, "What you resist persists." Not sure.
Yeah.
So there we go. What do you all notice in those different takes?
Sometimes we consider that making that cutoff, that distance, that decision that I'm not going to be relating to this person, particularly in the family. So cutoff has to do with the relationship across generations. So I'm not going to talk to my mother or to my uncle because they did A, B, C, and you have all sorts of reasons, and you believe it's a decision that you've made. Well, in reality, it's an emotional reaction. So it's not a decision. It is a response, a reaction rather to an emotional difficulty that you're having when you encounter that other person and whatever happens within you as you relate to that person. So you just can't stand it and you go. But then we make all these stories in our heads why it's right for us to do such a thing.
Mariana, I so appreciate that. That was in my takeaway, is to just be curious about the stories that are told in the family. Because I think families do such a good job of having this narrative that creates about why we don't talk to grandma or why we don't talk to that uncle. And for a generation to just get interested and curious about those stories and what time were those stories, what was going on at the time those stories were created. Because I think those facts often come through that there was a tension, a stressor in the family at that time. And the way that the family managed it was to not try and open the system or get curious, but to distance and cut off. So I appreciate that punch up around the narrative that the family comes up with to support that.
That reactivity or authenticity can be so subtle. I'm thinking of a family situation in my family. I have an older sister, and she was and is very important for the family, and particularly for my parents' marriage. She was very important in that triangle. Well, when she got married, and eventually she decided to move to a different city. Nothing wrong there, right? And she had two little girls then, and whatever. But I think that part of the decision to go, or the motivation, the not very obvious motivation, was that she needed more room to for herself. She felt too much entangled with my family and with my parents. So here she goes. She has a third girl, so three little girls. They are all very accomplished and an older woman. Now they're between 33 and 40. Well, none of them had been able to find a partner, even despite the fact that they wanted. And I'm talking about these things which apparently are not related. But the thing is, what was evident to me is that my sister comes back just a year ago from that other city into the city, and she reestablished more consistent contact with my mother, her mother, and siblings, and the husband's family. So her connections, family connections, really came up alive again, I would say. And now, I mean, of course, 30 years later, she is managing them differently. And all of a sudden, within a year, the three daughters have a partner.
Right.
Now this is not the recipe for finding a partner. What I'm trying to say is that when you create this distance, and this was not a terrible distance, not that she never talked to my mother, on the contrary, but there was a distance needed. What happens? All the energy goes into the nuclear family. Another way of saying it is that you have less people available to manage whatever goes on in life. So all the dependencies, the love, the care, the demands, the needs are all managed and handled within the nuclear family mostly. So the tension increases, and there's less air, if you will. The minute she connected with the rest of the family again in a more viable way, I think there was something that got freed and allowed these young women to do what they wanted to do in life. Who knows how this story is gonna end? But I have experienced that myself, living away from my family. I never thought that there was anything no cutoff, nothing emotional about my decision. Well, after studying Bowen theory, I can see that there's a portion of it. There are other things, but there's a portion of an emotional force that got me out of that family system to have a little more distance so I can manage better. But I also can see how much energy and demand is put in the nuclear family, and that has its challenges. So this is a mild case of caught up. And then if you think about extremes, is when then you don't talk to somebody in your extended family, that type of thing.
And I think, Mariana, that highlights that, your example highlights the advantage and disadvantage thing that I think of, where, maybe in the generation you're in, you think it reduces a significant amount of tension just to create some of that cutoff. But the next generation might be the ones who really begin to feel that disadvantage to not having those resources available, not having the stories about how the family got through tough times, or someone else to talk to when I'm getting real frustrated with my mother. Do I have these other resources in my family available to me? So I think that's such a good example to talk about the multi-generational process of cutoff.
Mm-hmm. One of the quotes from Dr. Bowen that I also had was, "The more a nuclear family maintains some kind of viable emotional contact with the past generations, the more orderly and asymptomatic the life process in both generations." And that's what he observed, right? It seems a little bit like, when you give your example, it seems a little bit like magic. But it's this observable process that seems to happen when those cutoffs are bridged. And I think your explanation of even just anxiety management is helpful. There's more places for that to go, or resources to handle. And yeah,
of course, the solution to this is not just stay home and be as close as you can, because then you can
right.
you can resource to the internal distance, which is you get depressed, you don't talk about things, you're always in a group setting where you don't talk to individuals, but you do like a group thing all the time. So there are other ways to manage to cut off or distance severely from people without having to go away. So it's not a matter of where you live, really. It's a matter of how you establish those person-to-person relationship with as many people as you can in your family.
I think the advantage that we have in the here and now is we're living in an age where I think we have technology to assist us in that. I have in-laws who are in Australia while I'm in Canada, and to be able to have resources where we can talk weekly and, my kid can see their face and have that one-on-one interaction, through technology is a real advantage being on the other side of the world. So to think about what are the resources available that people have to work on this contact.
Yeah, that it's not a physical distance isn't the same, and physical closeness doesn't guarantee this person to person.
The definition of person-to-person relationship would be, can you talk and relate one-to-one and talk about yourself and listen about the other person's life without having to bring others to the conversation or to, or physically. But it's how much can you know about the other person? Can you get curious about their life without, forgetting who you are, if you will? But that person to person is very hard to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I found it interesting. I was going to bring up, as my example, I find it interesting that lately there is sort of almost this movement around cutting off toxic parents, in quotes, like that there's lots of even clinicians advocating cutting off your parents, and lots of articles. The New York Times had an article, I think just last weekend or the weekend before, around this idea of cutting off your parents, and just how does Bowen theory offer people a different way of thinking about this than just this. I struggle to tolerate what my parents are saying or what they're doing, and so I want to just stop talking to them. The advantage to the individual to think about what is it like just to tolerate staying in contact. Maybe that looks, different for different people, but to think about how, I always say it's so interesting to me clinically when I sit with families who are not in contact with their family, and how much space, I think Dixie said this, it takes up in their brains, even though they're not in contact. They're thinking about these people pretty intensely on a regular basis. And I think that's interesting to think about that emotional process.
So I don't blame people that need to create that distance, because there are situations that are so painful. And so there is a reason behind it. So what do you do when you just can't tolerate, or it's just really against who you are today to connect to these people? Start at the edges, right? If your father is just impossible, I mean, you can't even think about, or even don't even know where he is, let's put it that way. And so how to connect? Well, you want to connect with the emotional field of that person. So sometimes it doesn't have to be the person that gives you the opportunity to connect to what was going on, what's the emotional field. So you can talk with a sibling of that person, or a cousin, or just, touch the edges, and that can give you information about what this cutoff is about. So yeah, I do understand people who just say, no, I'm gonna not go there, I'm not gonna go there. And maybe they're right. Maybe there are even safety reasons that you need to be away. Then touch other people in that emotional field, and that can get you somewhere.
I appreciate you bringing that up, because I do think that there is that, especially for safety reasons, or you don't know, how do you get clearer on what other resources might be on the outside? Thanks. I think that's important.
And I think that speaks to the difference between it being a completely emotional reaction and a little bit more thought through.
Yeah, people get a lot from going, for example, back to the original towns where their family came from, and visiting graves. I mean, what does a grave give you, right? It's not a person, but somehow you touch a field, and then maybe find a neighbor in that town that maybe knew or heard about your family or whatever it might be. It gives you something. And I haven't experienced it personally that way, but I've heard stories of people that just by the fact of going to the place where their family come from, something happens within that they get calmer, they something happens within. It's like the connection is reignited, and that creates I don't know, more avenues of dealing with things. I don't know exactly how to explain it, but it happens.
And I think I get interested too in families about what is the thing that makes even thinking about bridging cutoff or connecting with family members possible? Like what has to shift in a triangle or in a family that even that idea, that possibility seems available to them, whereas in the past maybe it didn't. Maybe someone has a conversation and gets interested in a grandparent, or visiting where their parents came from. I think that sometimes that's just useful to watch that shift.
Yeah. When I looked at my family diagram, I asked myself, well, who are the individuals that I'm closer to or more distant from? And I found a maternal aunt that I say I never see her. I don't even know about her life really, and I don't even talk to my cousins. So I thought, okay, easy enough. There's nothing, no stories, no grudges, nothing. Oh, I'm gonna call her. Well, 20 years later, I just haven't been able to do that. Good. I mean, why?
Mm.
I cannot explain that, but there's something about that relationship that just doesn't allow me to get closer. So I'm convinced that there's something about what happened in the previous generation, not a secret or anything, but just maybe the triangles that were active between my mother, her sister, her parents, that just keeps me away from it. So I can appreciate the power of the emotional forces that govern the relationships. I don't know the reason here, but I know there's something so powerful that just hasn't allowed me to make that phone call, which sounds very, very obvious. And so my point is that this for there, I think I respect a lot these forces that organize relationships that I don't understand fully, but I know they're there, and it just tells me something about the system that I'm curious about.
That seems to go back to what Katie was wanting to talk about, is can we look at this neutrally, right? Or like you say, just to respect this is present, right? Versus what's wrong with me that I haven't, or what's wrong with them because they do this or that.
And I think, I think that one of the things I wanted to touch on was the idea of distance, which is another mechanism that Bowen talks about. I see distance as a little different, than cutoff, that I think people can take a real thoughtful distance, a step back from family when things are pretty intense, that can be really useful to people to get clear, even if they're working on differentiation, as I think we'll talk more about, but that stepping back, that thinking time, that being able to manage one's own nervous system and then going back into the family to try and just see what's different, or decide what circumstances you want to do that. I think that can be useful. And I think that that's different than
It
the
is.
cutoff, which I think exists below. Mariana, you just did a good example about below the level of awareness, like something maybe is going on there that I can't put my finger on the why, but that there is this process that you're observing in the system. It's automatic.
I have hunches, but prove them. But yes, distance definitely. I would also characterize cutoff as the extreme form of distance that is fixed and that it just is transmitted over the generations as a way to handle things. So distance is a little more flexible, is more, uh, you know, um, fluid, and cutoff is much more uh, persistent and has more important consequences too.
My example was not a family example, so maybe it doesn't count, but sort of the first thing that came to mind was in my first year university, I broke up with the boyfriend that I had, gone to my graduation with. And then I successfully avoided seeing him for 4 full years of university. And I thought about, wow, I would light up when I would see him at the end of the hallway. And it was not a very big campus, right? And so the effort sort of that could take. And then thanks to Facebook, many years later, I sort of reached out and said my piece and sort of acknowledged some of my immaturity, but I don't know. That was sort of what came to mind in terms of that was, I don't know. I don't think it was thoughtful in any way. It was just the only way that I sort of knew how to manage. And then as I've learned about distance and cutoff and thinking about, oh, I kind of, that may be one of my go-to ways that I manage. But
Well, and then what you said before, I don't know who said it, but that you take this with you. So you
yeah,
run away from a relationship that didn't work for whatever reason, and then you decide that this is a good way of dealing with it. Okay, don't decide, you just do it.
yeah,
And you caught up with family members from previous generations. So you go to the next level, then you create your own family. As I was saying, it creates so much intensity that the level of intensity is the same in the new relationship than in the previous relationship. In the present, it might seem to have a more positive valence to it. So it feels good. It feels super cozy. This person really understands me. Finally, I have the family that I never had. And this is my husband's family, or the church, or whatever you find it, this group of identity and connection that finally gives you what you needed and what you didn't get. But that's not going to last, because it's bound to get overtaxing, to get uncomfortable, and then you don't know how to deal with it. So the only thing you need to know how to do is to cut off and go to the next. Some people do this repeatedly, some just maybe once or twice in life, but you take it with you. It's just a way of responding, and it's not one that allows for long-term relationships, really.
right. And I heard Anne McKnight say that often people get focused on the content or the issue around what what people disagreed on, but really cutoff is about this intensity. It's really less about the issue and more about the intensity with which we respond.
Yeah, I was going to highlight Anne McKnight because I think she's done a lot of thinking about cutoff. And even, I've heard her thinking that when cutoff can be a real resource to a system as a whole, as one branch might cut off and the other branch might be able to function a little better without that. So I think, I said that very poorly, but I know there's other resources to listen to her thinking on this, because I think she has, helped me think through this. Bowen theory, I keep coming back to the neutrality of how do I just understand this as an evolutionary adaptation of a system to try its best to keep going. So to think about this concept neutrally, as well as a family trying to do what they can. And then, I think we're talking about an individual's work on differentiation is, how do I think about how my family's gotten through generations in this way? And is there some way I want to think about doing things a little different? And this is where I just get curious about the person who gets interested in doing something about cutoff. Is I think something has to shift in the family. Someone has to decide to get curious. Maybe things get quite bad. I think sometimes in my own experience, when I'm pretty bogged down with a symptom, it's the first time I'm actually willing to look at that symptom and say, surely there's got to be a different way to go about this. So just to get interested in what it takes for someone to just, maybe it's an event. Yeah, I think sometimes, I've been interested in this new advent of ancestry, the DNA tests, where maybe someone gives you a DNA test for Christmas and you don't think anything else about it, but all of a sudden you have this new information about your system and you decide to get curious about it.
And I appreciate what you said before, Mariana, about even if you're not ready to go to that person, going to the outskirts of the systems that they're a part of as sort of that first step. Yeah. Well, any takeaway questions, resources, things I can put up in the show notes about?
Well, one
people
thing
can
that we haven't talked about is the reaction of the system to efforts to reach that cutoff. So you might be very, determined and convinced that this is a good thing for all the reasons that we talked about, and you try to do it, and then you either get sick, you find somebody that is getting angry at you, you don't find the time, things happen in life. So just be aware that the system is going to respond and react to that, and attempt at maintaining that cutoff because it had worked somehow. Probably poorly, but it has worked for the system. So just be aware that that's part of the reality of cutoff, that when you try to move it, something else bites back.
Such a good point. Thank you for bringing that up. I think, and this is where I know we talk about coaching later in our pitch for coaching, but I think, when one really decides to make a project out of this, I think this is what you just named, Mariana, is one of the real advantages, I think, that I've seen for myself in working with a coach who can continue to keep that wide lens and be interested in that response of the family. And then what does the person want to do with that response from the family? So I think that's one of the ways that I was going to say that I think cutoff is one of those concepts that I think a coach can be a real resource in thinking with someone about what they want to take on, how they might plan doing that.
The cost, the benefits, yeah. Well, my takeaway was family matters. The episode called Cutoff in Family Relationships. So I will post that one in the show notes. Yeah. Any other resources that?
Just to know that systems are particularly more open and flexible in moments of change. For example, weddings, births, funerals. So that's a good time to maybe reach out to somebody that you haven't, or to establish a conversation more at a personal level, maybe in a situation that you find yourself in a wedding and in a celebration, because those are times where the system is a little bit more flexible, so you can move more freely.
And I think, Mariana, I'm just going to build on yours, because I think one of my takeaways was really about these stories. I was thinking in a theory group about this idea of the narrative in the family, and how to just get curious about the stories that are being told, and where are your questions in those stories? How does that lead you to thinking about the people differently, and where might you get some facts behind some of those stories? So I find, weddings and funerals are such a place where these things happen. So I appreciate that advice.
Good. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Mariana. Learning this concept has been very helpful, a bit of a kick in the pants for me through the years. Wish I had maybe known it at age 18. But yeah, I hope our discussion today can be useful to our listeners as well, and what you notice as you go out into your relationships.
This podcast is produced by Living Systems, a nonprofit organization in Vancouver offering counseling and training programs in Bowen family systems theory across Canada.